Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 1. So, I hope that your first week went really well. But here we are, Chapter 1, and it's Citizens and Government. So, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the introduction. So, this chapter really lays the foundation for the rest of the semester. So, you're going to hear a lot of terms in this chapter, or you're going to see a lot of terms in this chapter that you will see all the way until chapter 14. Because really, what we're doing here is establishing exactly what kind of government the United States has. And to do that, first we need to talk about what is a government. What is the function of the government? Why did humans even start having them? Well, I'll tell you why. Because we wanted to prevent anarchy from occurring, right? And so when humans settled, this is a very long story, and I'm going to make it shorter though. When humans settled, when we started farming, we started settling. And when we started settling, we started building cities. And when we started building cities, we started building walls to go around those cities. And those walls had two functions. On the one hand, the wall was intended to keep people out of the city, right? So it's to protect people. On the other hand, the wall also functioned as a means to define what kind of benefits people that lived within the walls got. So, for example, what kind of benefits did citizens get? And we wanted an army, right? We wanted organized religion. We wanted a bureaucracy. We wanted laws, right? So if you think back to Hammurabi's code, right, an eye for an eye, one of the oldest legal codes, you have to think, why did it exist? Well, it existed because while humans love liberty, and we've talked about this before, but while humans really love liberty, they also like security, and the only way to get that is through a government. So we're going to talk about that today. So governments are institutions and procedures through which a territory and its people are ruled. And it functions as a means to protect citizens. And I'll just let you guys think about some other things that the government does. I think on page 6 of your textbook, it goes through a whole list of ways that the government is a part of your life that you might not even think of on a regular basis. Right? For example, when you wake up in the morning, right? I have a reasonable belief that when I wake up, that first of all, if I wanted to pray, I could, right? And what guarantees me that? Well, the First Amendment does. If I don't want to pray, I don't have to. That's also the First Amendment, right? And that's guaranteed us by the Constitution of the US. But also, let's say I sit down and eat, right? I have a reasonable belief that if I crack open an egg, it's not going to have slime and, something disgusting in it. And the reason that I'm able to have that belief is because the Food and Drug Administration, right? The FDA regulates that. I can get in my car and go to school or work. That's school. I can go to school and I know that my car is going to have reasonably safe roads. Now, I also live in North Little Rock, or I live in, so the roads aren't always in the tip-top condition, but I don't have to trek up a hill to get to school, right? I don't have to trek up a, treacherous mountain. There are roads. And the reason that there are roads is because we have a highway department. Now, right now, I'm not really going to distinguish between state and federal government. We'll get into that in chapter 3. But let's talk a little bit about trust in the government. So, if I asked you all, if you were sitting in front of me in a class, and I said, how many of you would say that you trust the government? I am telling you as someone who's taught here for 7 years that not a whole lot of you would be raising your hands. And there's a reason for that. Right, let me tell you a little bit about in 1960. We have this astounding statistic here that 75% of people in the United States in the 1960s trusted the government. In 2015, only 19% trusted the government, right? And that's pretty telling, isn't it? All right, sorry, I had to adjust that. But why is it that people do not trust Washington, D.C. to do what's right all or most of the time? Well, a few things happened, right? If you look at this chart here, it starts really declining in the 70s, and there's some reasons for that. One of them's Watergate. We won't get into that. But when polled in 2007, 54% of those surveyed believed that the Bush administration had deliberately misled the American public about whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. So whether or not you're a Republican or a Democrat, that doesn't matter. What we're looking at is just data here. And what it says is that people stopped trusting the government when they found out that maybe there weren't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Right? So we see a mark there in 2007. By 2012, people believe that Obama did not get the economy out of our Great Recession. Right? So we have a dip in 2007, 2012, and if we look at the Affordable Care Act, it led to a 2-week partial government shutdown, which was incredibly unpopular. Right? And so we have a shutdown right now, which is very unpopular for the Trump administration. Right? It never looks good when the government totally stalls. But also, and the book doesn't talk too much about this, but I would say media, right? Politicians in the limelight, right? If you look at these two, and if it were Obama in office, I had his tweets up here too. But if you look at the media and how they portray our government. You rarely hear about good things that members of our government do, right? Instead, we hear about people like Trump and Stormy Daniels or, what's his name? Well, I can't think of it. Al Franken, committing sexual harassment against someone. And we so rarely see the good. And that's because the media really loves to pick up on the negative because it keeps you watching. And so when we get to chapter 6, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, when you see things like Donald Trump talking about his IQ, right? People see that and they tend to lose trust in the government, right? Oh, and here's just to talk about a Democrat. I talked about a Republican, and anytime I use those jokingly, I try and talk about the other one. So here's Anthony Weiner, such a fantastic name for what he did. It's not fantastic what he did, but his name. So he was a congressman. He was a Democrat, sentenced to 21 months in federal prison after sexting with a 15-year-old girl and multiple other people as well. So this is one of the reasons we don't trust the government, right? We see these people who are supposed to be our representatives. They're supposed to be doing what's right by us, and they're not, right? And this is really bad news for democracy. Right? There's this concept called political efficacy, which is the belief that ordinary citizens can really affect what the government can do. In 2015, 74% of Americans said that elected officials don't care what people like them think. Right? And what this does is this leads to apathy. Right? People don't care about politics if they feel like they can't influence them. Right? And the question that I always have is, can democracy even exist if ordinary people aren't voting, right? And that's just something to think about. I'll say that you should trust the government, and that's my personal belief. Now, obviously, be a cynic. Always be a cynic. Always ask the question as to whether or not, what the government's doing is right. But overall, I tend to trust that the government is more transparent than the media would have us think, right? But let's talk a little bit about how government affects our lives every day, right? And I talked about that a little bit, but even if you have subsidized loans, the government subsidizes those. The government really keeps the bills on here at UAPTC, so it impacts more of our lives than just the really scandalous things we hear about on television. And again, this is just an introductory lecture, but let's talk about some terms that we'll be using. Citizen, right? And this is a native or naturalized member of the state or nation who owes allegiance to its government and entitled to its protection. And your book refers to it as active and informed membership of a political community, right? And so we live in a society that makes a distinction between citizens and non-citizens. So let's talk about some American values, right? Liberty, equality, and democracy, and I would even put security in there. But we are built on these ideas that we will have freedom from governmental control. And when we get into the next chapter, we'll talk about the American Revolution and why we have the kind of government that we have, right? But we want this idea of limited government. We really don't like the idea of the government influencing every aspect of our lives, right? We used to believe in something called laissez-faire capitalism, which meant basically that the government did not at all uh, influence or get involved in political dealings. Now we have more regulated capitalism, right? And so maybe these terms don't seem familiar to you, but regulated capitalism means, yeah, we can have people who own private businesses, but they have to have a minimum wage, right? So the minimum wage is a government regulation. Um, and people constantly argue about this in politics. All right, so we talked about this a little bit before, liberty and security, but again, they're always in conflict with one another. So let's talk about a few other types of government, and we're really going to focus on a republic and an all authoritarianism and totalitarianism. So the United States of America is a democracy, and a democracy is a system of rule that permits citizens to play a significant part in the governmental process, usually through the election of key public officials, right? So we have a democracy in the United States, but we also believe in the idea that ultimately governing is in the hands of the people. And we believe that the more people who participate in politics equally, the more democratic a nation we will have. But let's break that down. So the United States is not just a democracy, it's a representative democracy, right? And so we'll talk about in chapter 2 why we have a representative democracy as opposed to a direct democracy. But a representative democracy is a system of government in which the citizen selects representatives who play a significant role in government decision making. So what that means is that we elect people who then go serve us in Congress. So in Arkansas, for example, we have District 2, that's the Pulaski County area. In the House of Representatives, our representative is French Hill. In the Senate for all of Arkansas is Tom Cotton and John Bozeman. So those are the people that Arkansans elect, and then they go serve our interest in Congress. And what can you do if these folks are not serving your interest? Well, you can vote them out of office. All right, so this is a quick history lesson, but democracy is not new. It is not something that the United States created. It existed in Athens in the 5th century, right? But what they had was something called a direct democracy, which everyone that was a citizen, which most citizens were men, right? So it wasn't very many. But in ancient Athens, all citizens voted on everything directly. So that meant that if everyone who was a citizen wanted to have a say in the government, they could go down to the forum in Athens and they could vote on issues, right? But it was a very limited democracy, right? Also, the democracy didn't have a lot of checks, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. But let's say that everyone in this class said, we don't like Sam Staggs, so we want Sam Staggs to die. And you all voted, and the majority voted yes. I hope that wouldn't be the case. But the majority voted yes that I should die. Then guess what? In a direct democracy, I would die. And that's what happened to Socrates here. He was charged with corrupting the youth, and so they all decided he would die. And he did. But the United States doesn't have a direct democracy, and we have a representative democracy. But what stops that sort of thing from happening, right? We believe that the majority rules in the United States, but the minority also have rights. So, for example, well, the U.S. has a constitutional democracy, right? And this is a system of rule in which formal and effective limits are placed on the powers of the government, right? And so when I say formal and effective powers, what I mean, or limits, what I mean is formal in that we have a document, right? We have the Constitution. And effective is that it works, right? So we placed powers on our own government. And this was pretty revolutionary for the time. Again, I said we'll get into this a little bit more when we get into chapter 2, but when we jump from ancient Greece, right, to let's put a nice round date on it, 1776. Really, the United States became a revolutionary, and I said that twice, but it really became the model for a democracy in the modern world. And we created, again, a constitutional democracy. So we created limits on the power of our own government because we feared, and again, we'll get into this a little bit more next lecture, but we feared that if we had a government that was too powerful, that it would eventually just devolve into tyranny again, and we would end up with kings and queens that ruled over us. So instead, what we had is we had a constitution, which, if you look in your back of the back of your book, there's an entire constitution there. Okay, so again, we believe that the majority should rule in a constitutional democracy, but the minority also has rights, and that's important, right? Because yes, so what if the majority of the United States, let's think 1865, right? In 1865, the vast majority of the United States supported the institution of slavery, right? But we have a constitutional democracy, and we say that even though the majority rules, that those minorities are constitutionally protected in the United States, and that they too should have rights, right? 1865 is when slavery ended with the 13th Amendment. Don't worry, we'll get there in chapter 4. All right, so I'm going to skip over this oligarchy. Don't really want to talk about that too much. But let's talk about authoritarian governments. So remember, in a constitutional democracy, there are formal and effective limits placed on the power of the government. In an authoritarian government, it's a system of rule in which the government recognizes no formal limits, but are restrained by the power of social and economic institutions. And a perfect example of this is Russia under Vladimir Putin. I'm sure you all have heard that name in the news quite a bit. But, so again, authoritarian, the government recognizes no formal limits, right? So they don't have a constitution which prevents the government from getting too powerful, right? But they do have outside forces that check the power of the government. So when I say social institutions and economic institutions, what I'm talking about is, a great example of this is a few years ago, Russia tried to go into the Crimea and take over land. But the United States stepped in and said, not that we would go to war with them if they continued, but that we would place economic sanctions on them. So what we would do then is we would sanction the power of the government, or that we would sanction the economy. So we wouldn't trade with Russia, right? So we didn't go to war with them, but we checked the power of the government. So Russia stopped going into Crimea because they couldn't afford to lose trade partners with the United States, right? So authoritarianism, there's no constitution, but outside forces check the power of the government. Let's talk a little bit about totalitarianism. Now, the root word for totalitarianism is total, if that helps you. But totalitarianism is a system of rule in which the government recognizes no formal limits, right? So there's no constitution, and it seeks to absorb and eliminate other social institutions that might challenge it, right? So no constitution, and really no check on the power of the government. And I put Adolf Hitler here because he's probably the most well-known example of totalitarianism. However, we could look to North Korea and look at Kim Jong-un as well. He's totalitarian. But let's just look at the rise of Nazis very quickly in Germany. Right, so throughout the 20s, Nazis gained support by criticizing the democratic government. That's right, before, and this won't go on for long, but it's a quick history lesson, but before Germany became totalitarian, it was a democracy, right? And there were lots of folks who were unhappy with it, namely the Nazi Party. And so in 1933, he was elected as Chancellor of Germany. That's right, Hitler was elected. And as soon as he came to power, one of the first things that he did was ban all other political parties, right? So let's bring this back to the term totalitarianism. one, there are no formal limits because he abolished the Weimar Republic. He abolished the Constitution, so there's no formal and effective limits. And there's no check on his power because he banned all other political parties, right? And amassed a very large army and took over any other countries that would fight against him, right? So this is a good example of totalitarianism. So just as a quick review, we have constitutional democracy. Remember, there are formal and effective limits placed on the power of the government, and the government, well, that's it. Formal and effective limits placed on the power of the government. And then we have authoritarianism, where there are no formal and effective limits placed on the power of the government, but the government can be checked by outside forces. And then we have totalitarianism, where there's no formal or effective limits placed on the power of the government, and the government is actively seeks to destroy opposition. Right? And so one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this is because, this is an introductory chapter, but it's important to discuss things like, how does totalitarianism happen? Right? How did we get a constitutional democracy? And how did that democracy exist at a time when totalitarianism can exist across the world? Right? How does this happen? Right? And just to remind you that Hitler was elected. Right? And when you have a totalitarian nation, what happens is that there's no check on the power of the government, so the government can do what it wants. But we have a constitutional democracy, right? So the majority rules, but the minority also has rights. The United States is not totalitarian. There will be a question on the test for those of you who listen. There's a question on the test that will say, is the United States totalitarian? Or give me an example of totalitarianism. And I'll say the United States in 2018 or 2019. And that's not the correct answer, right? Germany during World War II is the correct answer. All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this lecture. Perhaps I'll get better at talking to a computer as time goes on. I'm used to being in the classroom, talking to people face to face, so bear with me, and I'll try and do this again for the next lecture. Thanks so much. Have a fantastic day, and bye. Maybe.